The original Godzilla film dealt with a wide range of ethical questions and dilemmas surrounding the emergence of Godzilla. Dr. Yamane even believes that Godzilla should be studied and not killed, since the monster has the ability to survive radiation, a feat which could prove very useful to humanity. Meanwhile, characters like Ogata adamantly support the killing of Godzilla, as the monster is very dangerous to have in the world. Minus One is more focused on more common people. The story is focused on Koichi and his close friends rather than the wider network of scientists, politicians, and reporters like the first film. We see the horrors of war through his eyes in a very personal way. Whilst the original Godzilla film showed the horrors of conflict on a societal scale, treating us to packed hospitals and people dying in the path of Godzilla, I wouldn't say either way is better than the other at expressing the feelings of war. The original wanted to express the sheer scale of the destruction, while Minus One focuses on the mental turmoil of one man. But Minus One and the original Godzilla are completely different movies in terms of what Godzilla represents. Godzilla in the original was meant to be a metaphor for nuclear warfare. The film focuses on the uncovering that the monster is radioactive and on the reasons behind it. The film ends with Yamane stating his fears that if nuclear testing continues, another Godzilla may appear. Meanwhile, in Minus One, Godzilla is a representation of a war that never ends in the minds of the soldiers and civilians who live through it. Godzilla's arrival is a painful reminder that war doesn't end with the peace treaty. This is exemplified in that, in the original, Godzilla's attack on Tokyo is central to the movie. It is the attack that changes Emiko and shows the true meaning of the film. It is a long sequence that takes the audience throughout the city and treats us with wide shots of the entire city burning. Meanwhile, in Minus One, the Ginza attack is a very important matter, but it is a much shorter sequence, as we focus on the main characters of Noriko and Koichi. It still harkens back to imagery of the nuclear blast. However, while the original film made Godzilla's attack a slow-motion nuclear explosion, Minus One shows it more directly, with the explosion and then the resulting black rain, which creates a pretty haunting image of Koichi screaming in anger and terror as it falls around him. The original film deals with the war too on a personal level, but less directly. Dr. Yamane didn't fight in that war, and Ogata and Emiko were too young to be in the war. Serizawa is the character who was in the war, and he carries that with him everywhere. He lost his eye in the war and fears more than anything else new weapons being deployed in warfare, because he experienced the war firsthand. Since I've already reviewed the original Godzilla, I think it is about time that I do a full review of Minus One. The first thing I want to talk about is Godzilla. Now, I am a conservationist. If there is an animal in the world, and especially a rare one, I want it to be protected. Same goes with Godzilla, and you can't blame me. It was this franchise that raised me to believe this. Yuji Shinoda from Godzilla 2000 told me that we must not think of killing Godzilla, but on studying the animal, as the properties of Godzilla can prove useful to mankind. Meanwhile, Sarah in Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla looks at these animals as things that deserve to live and be preserved regardless of if they help humanity or not. Godzilla himself, on the other hand, will forever be indifferent towards humanity. His destruction is a sort of revenge against humanity for what we have done to the natural world. It is our actions coming back to us. I will never be comfortable with the prospect of killing Godzilla, a living thing. At least in the original, Serizawa's weapon was something that dealt with the monster quickly, even though it did still writhe in pain. While in this movie the plan is longer and more drawn out. In the case of this movie, we still get to be presented with the nuances surrounding the appearance of this creature. Obviously, I perfectly understand every character's point of view in this movie on taking down Godzilla. He blew up the entirety of Ginza, and more with one blast of his heat ray. The plan to kill Godzilla doesn't come from revenge, it is from protecting the future. The movie shows that this is the reason why a lot of these soldiers fought, and why they go in to stop Godzilla, even though Godzilla is so dangerous. They want to save their country. In this film, Godzilla represents the never-ending war that doesn't leave the minds of those who live through it. All these soldiers were disenfranchised by the war, because the actions their leaders took destroyed the entire country. The war was not a glorious event for these men, but rather it brought home destruction and meant certain death for many of those who fought in it. Godzilla's arrival on Odo Island at the beginning of the film is Koichi experiencing this conflict. He was already told to be a kamikaze pilot, but refused to take part in that mission. Then he was asked to man his plane to kill Godzilla, an act he could not perform due to fear. However unclear, it seems unlikely that that would have killed Godzilla then, as the other roles didn't even phase it afterwards. When these men pull together at the end under the direction of Kenji Noda, it is their atonement for the war. Their government has abandoned them. The United States isn't doing anything. It is up to the crowd. I really like this wide range of teamwork that encompasses so many people, because many of the problems in the world are not solvable by one man like they are presented in a movie. They require the combined efforts of many to fix. Another thing I appreciate a lot about this movie is Noda's plans. And what pushes the anti-military themes of this movie is that he is not sacrificing the men of his country to stop Godzilla. Noda makes a point that he wants no one to die, and he will ensure it. He then directly criticizes Japan for their recent actions for treating life too cheaply before and during the war. Once again, this movie is from the Japanese perspective. It doesn't deal with the victims of Japanese expansion, but it does deal with what the Japanese had to go through because of the actions of their own government. This film is passing for me because it acknowledges that the war and the subsequent deaths do fall on the Japanese government. Noda wants to reverse this, as he wants to do something that will actually help the country, and so does everyone around him. They all want to play their part. In this case, I prefer this ending to Shin Godzilla, as in Shin Godzilla, the higher-ups in government sent a lot of people to die to stop Godzilla in the final act, and they aren't even given the proper respect. I respect this film for valuing human life so much. It is true with Godzilla that a sensitive touch must be added, as in the original. These films are about humanity, and all the drama and despair that goes with it, but the camaraderie and empathy too. The point in stopping Godzilla is to stop more people from dying. And I really like how this film accepts that the history of Japan is not perfect, but that is okay, and it was filled with people, and we can look back on that and try to understand it. Godzilla, on the other hand, is another interesting critique of the military. Despite the characters not thinking about this, the audience is shown the pain that has been inflicted on Godzilla. A poor animal, we see his face burn during a nuclear test, and the aftermath of his own atomic breath leaves him charred and in pain. But what I find most interesting of all is that Godzilla is destructive on its own, of course. He is born too tall, too strong, too heavy, in this case very territorial, but he is not evil by choice. But when Godzilla inflicts the most incalculable damage is after the military strikes, and Godzilla's attack therefore comes from defense, not just because he felt like it. When military tanks fire on him in Ginza, that is when Godzilla lights up his atomic breath and causes the explosion. Same with the battleship that attacked him. The military made the situation so much worse, once again plunging Japan further into despair. One of my problems with Shin Godzilla is that I feel it did not adequately criticize the military enough. One of my favorite scenes in that movie is towards the middle when Godzilla annihilates Tokyo. It is a somber scene, as for the first time since World War II, American planes are bombing Tokyo, and in defense, Godzilla, who is having all this pain inflicted upon him, unleashes an array of atomic fire onto the city and into the air. The scene seems to focus more on Godzilla himself than on the military or anything else. The scene itself can be interpreted a few ways. Either the military made it worse, or in this case, the US is making Japan's problems worse. If that is the criticism the creators of this movie want to express, I say go for it, as the US has retained many military bases in Japan since the end of World War II, and there are problems that go with that. But Godzilla did not react the same way to when the Japanese self-defense forces fired on him earlier in the movie. So was Godzilla representing a stark, almost visceral revenge on the United States for their continued military and political presence? I'm not sure, but it is where Godzilla's pain is most presented. Now, of course, the difference here is that the bombs deployed by the Japanese weren't as powerful as the American bombs, but a lot of firepower was still thrown at Godzilla. The message seems clear here. Japan's defense is up to Japan. It's a good message. Japan has agency in itself.
My problem is that the criticisms of the Japanese military itself are thrown at the old days during World War II. The film doesn't mention this often, but one of the characters states that the military shouldn't be overconfident, as the last time the military was deployed, over 3 million Japanese died, and will not mention tens of millions of other people killed outside Japan. But by the end of the movie, the Japanese self-defense forces are saviors of the country and are hardly the expansionist and dangerous military of the past. But what's the difference? The United States shouldn't be firing bombs on Japan, risking civilian casualties, but the self-defense forces can. Of course, at the end of the film, the plan is to use non-military weapons. The decision Japan had to make was a difficult one in using weapons on Godzilla, who was being destructive. It's just odd to me how similar actions in the story are presented differently in consequences. Shin Godzilla is interesting. Its main character and the rest of those who hatched the plan to save Japan are outcasts, who don't think in the way of the system. The system that wasn't properly prepared for Godzilla, which in the film Goro Maki had warned of, but left Japan to its own devices. The government doesn't properly respond to the issue, but the system and the government are left the same and transform into the saviors of Japan. It's a more hopeful message that Japan can pull together and show the nuances of each character, where they deal with the economics and morals of this. Perhaps the military was too brash at the beginning, but they are still described as the only ones who can save Japan. While on -1, the people who saved Japan are ex-military, or ex-navy to be specific, but they were no longer fighting for that military. They were fighting for their country. They used weapons, but not new ones, just what was left over. Same with using a machine gun to get rid of mines in the ocean. These weapons are being put towards an actual use before they are decommissioned. If only they weren't made in the first place. Shin Godzilla can be a difficult movie to interpret, as nuance is given both to the Japanese and American governments. And consider when the film was made, maybe the question surrounding the Japanese military wasn't as pressing as it has been getting. With China becoming a seemingly bigger threat with each passing day, Japan has recently begun to arm itself even heavier than before, and has been building more military bases to combat the issue with support and backing from the US government. However, citizens of Japan, especially from older generations, have been pushing back against this rapid military buildup, seeing military bases as only creating targets for missiles to be fired at, and fearing that Japan's decision-making will once again lead to war. As in the case of China, they may only grow more aggressive if more military bases are built up closer and closer to their borders. This isn't to defend China's actions either, but you can see the feedback loop. In places such as Okinawa, the Pacific War is still very much remembered, and the blame for the loss of life doesn't fully rest on the Americans, but on the Japanese government as well. It would be nice to say that the Japanese Empire was completely dissolved at the war's end, but that is not true, as Okinawa had long held independence before it was incorporated to Japan, and the fear that they will be made into another target of war because of Japan still lingers in some places in Okinawa. The questions surrounding the Japanese military don't all lay in the past. There's still a lot to analyze and interpret about what is going on today. Godzilla -1 is unique. Most Godzilla films have taken place in a contemporary setting, while Destroy All Monsters took place in the future for the time it was made in. But this is Godzilla's first ever period piece, and the decision to set it immediately following World War II was no arbitrary one. Godzilla was born from the pain and suffering of that conflict, but when it comes to its messages on the military, Godzilla -1 is of course criticizing the Japanese government of the 30s and 40s, but I don't believe it is criticizing the current government as well. There's no film made that isn't affected by the times it was written in. In terms of -1, in the film, the characters and story criticize the government as it is, not in the past. Now, despite taking place a lot in 1947, it is really interesting to see characters disagree with the government as is. The government and the military is an organization that sacrificed the lives of its own people to achieve its goals, not too dissimilar to what the Japanese government did at the end of Shin Godzilla, but is presented differently in this movie. There is a fear that Godzilla must be stopped before it reaches Tokyo, and the warship needed won't reach fast enough. But the only plan the government has is to send other boats into the area that are not even close to being equipped with dealing with such an issue. It is as Kenji Noda says, the government is treating human lives too cheaply. The military is an active force in sacrificing lives. It is their speciality. Kill more on the other side, but deaths on their side are acceptable and given margins. Kenji Noda, the captain, and Koichi have all felt this firsthand. Their military told them to die for their country. It would have meant absolute death for them if the war had dragged on for even a little longer. And again, they are called out far from home to die again, and only just managed to survive. Militaries are inherently deadly organizations, and as long as one country in the world has one, we are all in danger. But back to the movie. This film may be warning the viewer again about what has happened to Japan in the past, and therefore what could potentially happen in Japan again, when it focused on military expansion. Other films in Japan have utilized similar techniques to criticize the current Japanese government for abandoning Article 9 of its constitution in favor of more military, by setting films in World War II, especially in the waning days of the conflict where civilians were feeling the most damage. The way of expressing the message has been critiqued for being purposefully manipulative of the audience's emotions by giving us likable characters and then hating them with unimaginable trauma to further a political message. However, I feel that while difficult to find the line in making a tasteful film about such an issue, it is something we do as humans to grapple with such traumatic and widespread events. They are put into stories and metaphors are made. Personally, from my viewpoint, I find this to be a good lesson being retaught through stories by these writers and directors. Stories have always had messages, and the messages of these may be political, but so do a lot of stories. Not to say we should be open to all stories with political messages, but in the sense of Japan's war, it really happened. And the ones that fought for spreading that war and bringing it back to Japan was Japan's government. So I find it understandable that writers seeing similar things being done by the current government. It makes sense why the parallels are made, even if history itself isn't exactly one of repetition and parallels. There's a fear that something wrong can happen again. And well, a lot of people really did live through those times, and there are stories to tell. But I can still see the point that it is using a conflict to criticize a different issue. In any case, for stories, it's probably better to use fictional characters in that case. However, I won't act like this debate is concluded, and I am open to discussion about it.
I want to focus in on Koichi's character. At the end of the war, he is made into a kamikaze pilot, but Koichi decides not to go through with his mission, and he lands his plane on Oda Island. A nice reference to the original, as Oda Island is not a real place. But it was where Godzilla was first seen in the original film. Anyway, Tachibana catches on that there's nothing wrong with Koichi's plane. However, Tachibana agrees with Koichi that killing oneself in the war at this point is completely meaningless, especially since the outcome is so clear. However, that night, the island is attacked by Godzilla before his radiated form. What I like about this scene is how terrifying it is. It wasn't presented at all as an entertaining action scene, but as complete terror. A lot of this is accomplished through the camera taking us to the scene on the level of the humans, giving Godzilla a terrifying perspective. I will say I appreciate in other films when the camera is on Godzilla's level, but for a Godzilla film like this, the terror is very well communicated when Godzilla looks so big compared to the humans. This was something I noticed in the original film. We see a lot of people in their final seconds, but we don't usually see them die directly. Instead, we are presented with what they are seeing. I find it a more tasteful way of presenting the scene, especially since it is based on real events. We, the audience, watch as if we were experiencing it ourselves in a way. Now, in -1, we definitely see the deaths of people, especially in this scene, but it serves to show how much trauma it inflicted on Tachibana and Koichi, as they had to witness all of it. The thing about the deaths of all those men was how unceremonious it is. Godzilla represents the war that never ends in the minds of those who live through it, especially the soldiers, and war is unceremonious about those who die in it. The Japanese government wasn't caring for their people and saw them as expendable. Kenji Noda even goes on to blame the Japanese government for these actions, including poor supply chains, the government that hid information to save face, which by the way is definitely not a problem limited only to the Japanese government. In any case, this movie may be throwing shade at the current Japanese government for its handling of the Tohoku earthquake too, like Shin Godzilla, and the Tohoku earthquake cost thousands of lives. A lot of blame for that is thrown at the government for not preparing for such a disaster, and its new military expansion, treating lives all too cheaply. When these men die, it is for nothing, and for Koichi and Tachibana, they have to live with that. When Koichi returns home, he sees the devastation brought by the US bombs. His house and the entire neighborhood has been reduced to rubble. His neighbor Sumiko finds him and calls him a disgrace. She represents the citizens who had to face the war on the home islands, which was the constant bombing of civilian targets by the US government. Sumiko is consumed by trauma and grief as well. All her children died of the fire bombings. Koichi, she sees the opposite of what was promised by her government. The war was supposed to be victorious. It was supposed to end in a resounding defeat of the enemy. But it didn't end that way. The propaganda was wrong. It always had been. As she processes that, she takes it out on Koichi, initially putting the blame of the lost war on Koichi, and extent the other soldiers who returned home because they didn't do their job. In Koichi's specific case as a kamikaze pilot, of course, Koichi's actions and the actions of every kamikaze pilot would not have turned the tide of the war. But as we see that the war's end is hard to accept for everyone. Koichi was first blamed by Tachibana for the deaths of his men, even if it was likely Koichi's actions may have angered Godzilla more instead of stopping it, and that, well, Koichi was young. Koichi was sent out to war, and he hadn't experienced any combat before that, but Koichi has to live with that guilt, and he has to live with his home country destroyed, the one that he was enlisted to protect. However, Koichi is presented with an alternative life. His parents, though dead because of the war, beg their son to come back alive. Koichi doesn't know what to think of that at first, but then he is presented with Noriko. Noriko tells Koichi that he must live. She begs him not to risk his life now that he has survived the war. She believes he should live, no matter what else has happened. Koichi and Noriko begin to create a life after the war with Akiko, and have to admit, I found it quite sweet. Even Sumiko, who told Koichi that she was done with caring after the war, steps in to help the couple and Akiko. Slowly they rebuild their homes right where they had been before. Over time, they slowly become sturdier and more put together. Koichi, though, can't not get the war out of his mind. As the months go by, he is still tormented by it, and wakes up from dreams, before hoping that he had died on the island too and was hallucinating this life. He struggles with living when so many others didn't. He cannot understand why he still lives, and for that he becomes distant with Noriko and Akiko. I really love this portrayal of a soldier, to show that war destroys a person, not prop them up. There was nothing glorious in what Koichi had to go through. We see the opposite view of this from Mizushima, who did not go to war. To him, he wants to defend his country, to do something for it. He feels envy towards Koichi for being in the war and learning to fly a plane. This, however, only upsets Koichi. Koichi tells him he had better not meant what he had said regarding wishing the war had lasted longer so he could have joined. Mizushima continues to want to be of use to his country. He wants to save it from Godzilla. Noda and Akitsu both agree to not have him accompany them on their mission, though. Akitsu tells Mizushima one of my favorite lines in the movie: "Not being in the war is something to be proud of." It's such an amazing line for flipping the usual narrative that soldiers can be proud of their time in combat and defending the country. Instead, we are confronted with a truth that not participating in that war was a good thing. It is completely against all propaganda ever, but that is beautiful. Mizushima's want to work for his country isn't in itself a bad thing. It is only when it is warped to be a kill and get killed scenario that it is problematic. At the end of the movie, Mizushima's want to help his friends and save his country sees him rescue the entire operation stopping Godzilla, with the people, not just those in war, but entire group effort to save the country. Back to Koichi. When he loses Noriko, he is at his lowest point and embarks on a death mission to finally complete his kamikaze mission. He knows the only person he can get for this is Tachibana. Tachibana goes along with it, despite his initial anger at Koichi. But despite his lingering anger at Koichi, he still doesn't believe in the kamikaze idea. He tells Koichi how to save himself, because he believes too that Koichi should live. Kenji Noda expresses fear towards the end of the film about Koichi, a former kamikaze pilot, taken to the air again. I really appreciate this detail. Kenji Noda is smart, but he is very attuned with his and other people's emotions. So is Akitsu. Though he was in a drunken state when he first brought out the plane to Koichi, his worry was visible. He asks Koichi if he has a death wish, and tells him that he can't avenge Noriko, because what has happened, and Koichi did not reveal his feelings to Noriko. Akitsu then later shouts at Koichi to not orphan Akiko. Stopping Godzilla isn't merely revenge, it is for protecting what we have. What I like about the scene where Koichi applies his plane into Godzilla's mouth is the reaction of his friends, who all fear he is killing himself. You can tell that they would rather die in Godzilla's explosion than see their friend die in such a way. But Koichi lives, and he chose to live. He made that decision himself. He decides to live for himself, or his friends, or Akiko. When Koichi returns to land, he finds out that Noriko is still alive, which I will admit I was very happy to see. Anyway, he breaks down crying. I really appreciate this. When they went in the fight against Godzilla, everyone is initially quiet because they had gone through so much, and the last we see of Koichi is him crying. And I think that is okay. I'm really glad they show that he was willing to express his emotions to Noriko and no longer hold them in. As for all that stuff about the infection or whatever on Noriko's neck, that may signify the mark that Godzilla left behind. When Noriko first encounters Godzilla, she falls into shock. She has to live with it the same as Koichi, and she already went through the war. I just really hope they don't do some weird plot lines with that in the future. I don't think this film needs a sequel within itself. However, if they do a sequel, they have the perfect opportunity to set it in 1954. I'm just saying that would be an amazing way to bring it full circle. Anyway, the last shot of the film is Godzilla's flesh regenerated in the ocean. This last shot is interesting. This film is more optimistic than the original. It still takes us to those dark places, but shows us healing as well, and hope for the future. It shows humanity pulling together and doing something for our other man. Meanwhile, the original ends on a very tragic note. Serizawa rightfully does not trust humanity with knowledge of the oxygen destroyer, and decides that the only way to ensure that it's never used is to kill himself. It's self-sacrifice, but it is immensely tragic. All the characters are devastated at this. Then Yamane issues the final line in the film, ominously predicting that nuclear tests continue. Someday, somewhere in the world, another Godzilla may appear. Meaning Serizawa's sacrifice for Japan may not even last long. The film was released in the 50s after Japan had built itself up again, partly profiting off the Korean War, former Japanese colony no less. But Godzilla's arrival is to bring the war back into the minds of all those who watched the film. The people who made this film remember the destruction of Tokyo from the actual fire bombings. They witnessed the war firsthand. Minus One is a 2023 film, looking far back and showing how we can overcome these hardships, which is definitely true, but the original showed something else, a very dark side of humanity, an almost hopeless view that no matter what, we are stuck in a cycle where wars and weapon testing will one day lead to our ultimate destruction. We may be able to live comfortably now, but the war still happened, and its consequences are everywhere. Godzilla is a symbol of post-war Japan, of a post-war that never ends. He can only emerge from the aftermath of what has happened. Godzilla is the one mistake we can't undo, not as long as there are nuclear weapons in the world. And Minus One, despite the more optimistic tone deriving from the focus on people moving on from war to life, Godzilla still can't be put down. Koichi sees Godzilla almost as the dead returning to make sure Koichi never forgets what happened. As time moves on, the war fades from memory, and we live on. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but Godzilla is that constant reminder. Godzilla remains as an almost beautiful creature. Even in his death at the end of the movie, he is bathed in the light of a setting sun as blue beams fade from his body. Godzilla is that monster that has destroyed so much, but we made him. He cannot suffer full responsibility. This franchise has always been good at that, making Godzilla sympathetic, sometimes even implying that he hates humanity for what was done to him. We see this especially in the Heisei run of the series, which even made Godzilla's foes sympathetic too. Godzilla was a dangerous monster, and he was pitted against other dangerous monsters. But they were more than that. As one example goes, Violante, the result of genetic engineering taken too far, fighting against the result of splitting the atom. Both monsters have feelings, and it is tragic that in their creation humanity can only fight them. External forces are determining who they are. It is even revealed that Godzilla and Rodan care for the same things humanity does, protecting their children. In Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, the fighting is ended when Godzilla is united with an infant of his kind. Up to this point, while tragic, he was always presented as being very aggressive. In all previous films of that timeline, Godzilla would get defeated in some way, even if not permanent, but here he wins, completely destroying everything humanity put in his way so he could protect his son. Now we see that he is caring, not just aggressive. By Godzilla vs. Destroyer, we are presented again with the Oxygen Destroyer, a device that is on the verge of being brought back,
Initially, it is thought to be the only thing that can stop Godzilla before his meltdown destroys the Earth. Emiko warns against this, remembering what Serizawa showed her of the weapon. The short-term gain of stopping Godzilla cannot outweigh the emergence of this weapon. At the end of the film, the Oxygen Destroyer does not have to be used. Alternate means are used to prevent Godzilla's meltdown from destroying the planet. But Godzilla, his son, Destroyer, and Rodan all have in common is that they are victims of humanity, consequences we forever have to deal with. But as I said, that Godzilla will be around as long as we have nuclear weapons. Even in a future where we do get rid of all those weapons, Godzilla will remain. Because he isn't nuclear weapons, he is the victim, the natural world returning to us. After the war, many survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ostracized for it. Because knowledge of the new bomb wasn't well known, people feared that these survivors would carry the radiation with them and poison them too. This wasn't true. People with radiation sickness can't spread it. But this idea had a suffocating effect on many of their lives, which had already been crushed by war. The 1954 film, I believe, did a good job in not alienating the people affected by the bomb, but instead showed their sufferings and showed the care that people took to help them. They need our sympathy. Godzilla may have intaken that radiation, mutated it, and came back to us, like the winds carrying radiation over the seas and land, same as the Lucky Dragon number 5. The blast from that US nuclear test was twice as large as predicted, spreading fallout to the ship, poisoning those on board. I don't think it is a mistake that Godzilla never follows the plan, that he emerges unexpectedly and causes more damage than expected, because we humans don't know everything. When we play with the destructive powers of the universe, we have to contend with that. But these people who lived through it, they are real. They are real. And they deserve our sympathy. Godzilla shows us two sides of humanity. It shows us two trying to find our way in the world, a lot of time from Japan's perspective. In the 1984 return of Godzilla, Japan has to live in between the US and the USSR as they try to navigate the return of Godzilla while these two superpowers close in with their own ideas. Shin Godzilla contends with those fears, and so does this movie, showing the US abandoning Japan for political reasons, and Japan's own government abandoning Japan. I believe these fears are universal. Who, in the Cold War as a citizen, feels stuck between two powers on the verge of destruction? Who has a perfect government? Minus One presents a hopeful message, though, that somehow we persevere anyway, that we do it together, to live for our country, for our friends and families, and not die for them. At the end of the day, I really appreciate this franchise. The original Gojira was made by those who lived through the war, and you can feel the emotion running through it because of that. Even a film like Godzilla vs. Hedorah has that. It was made by Yoshimitsu Banno, reacting to what pollution had done to the environment and the people of Japan. And you can feel that, even if the film is a bit odd. Shin Godzilla was made by those who remember the Tohoku earthquakes happening, and while I may criticize the film for, in my opinion, not landing the message, I still appreciate it for what it shows, what it tries to say about humanity reacting to a disaster situation, how we fumble but get through anyway, how any of us, outcasts and those who think differently, could bring the new perspectives that wouldn't otherwise be imagined in the system, how we all matter, as was said in Mothra vs. Godzilla, which has some problems, that there are many good people, but even bad people have a right to live. Minus One was made at a special time, when we are removed enough from the war that we can look back and interpret all that has happened and see what it has led to. That was a truly special movie. I suppose that works as a good conclusion. I will just add a general review here because I feel Minus One deserves it. Minus One had amazing actors and a perfect script. There was a subtlety to all the characters. The way Koichi mentioned that his job was not going to be like the kamikaze pilots was so perfect in showing that was still on his mind that he used it as an example, but in a way kind of set up later that they were moving beyond that, that they would never be a kamikaze pilot. Not to mention the soundtrack was absolutely stunning. The music so perfectly carried the film. Yet they still use Akira Ifukube's original themes, which I feel are practically required for a Godzilla film.
I like that Godzilla's original theme is brought back, and the theme we know for him that was originally used for the military is given to the citizens in defending their country against Godzilla. Everything was beautiful. The orange color palette, the sets, and the pacing all perfect. I really felt the tension in the boat scene and in Godzilla's swim towards Tokyo when it became clear he wasn't going to be stopped. And I know I talked a lot about the citizens taking it upon themselves to defend Japan and my appreciation of that. But I'm not a libertarian or anything. I don't believe in no government. I'm just with the characters in me against a government that doesn't value life. They still worked in a collectivist action and practically made their own government in a way. I do believe that government should be used for things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, public transportation, among other things. I just wanted to make that clear. Once again, that's just my opinion. Well, I think that's the end of this video. So as always, thanks for watching.